Bye-bye. You start off, okay?
All right. So there is a whole book by an English author and filmmaker named Leslie Woodhead, and it's called How the Beatles Rocked the Kremlin. And by the way, one very important note, Leslie Woodhead is in a hospital in Manchester in the UK right now fighting with coronavirus.
Oh, wow.
So I'm constantly in touch with his wife, who is American, Reggie Nadelson. So she keeps me updated, but the situation is quite tense. So let's all wish all the best to Leslie Woodhead. Now, to the question, I think that of course politically or economically, rock music and the Beatles and Машина времени and all these, it did not have a significant impact on the fall of the communist regime and the Soviet Empire. But if we talk about cultural impact and more wide than this, the emotional impact, then I'm pretty sure that their influence has been tremendous. Because starting in the 60s and the 70s with rock music and the hippie style and later the punk style and so on, it became obvious that the Western cultural and lifestyle agenda became dominant in the Soviet Union. That the young builders of communism, the normal Soviet boys and girls, they've been no more with Pavka Korchagin or whoever, the heroes of the Soviet propaganda and so on. Their heroes were now those long-haired guys who played sometimes incomprehensible songs in English language to electric guitars. And the amount of those young people was millions and tens of millions. So a whole generation of Soviet youngsters were ready for something completely different. And they understood that, the most important music, the best literature and visuals and so on, it was elsewhere. It was not in the Soviet Union, but it was in the rotting West. And of course, this feeling that life za bugrom, beyond the hill, is more interesting and more fun. It was, of course, a very strong emotional and also I think intellectual impact on this young generation. And it was exactly this young generation who've been the generation of perestroika, and later in the 90s the generation of building of the new Russia. Well, unfortunately, this impact got lost somehow later in the 21st century. But anyway, in the 80s, I think this generation played the main role, and it's because those tens of millions of young people were prepared for freedom, for democracy, for another kind of culture, not necessarily socialist realism or whatever. It was, of course, the one of the most important reasons why the reforms have succeeded.
Thanks for that answer. You used the word fun to describe kind of what people were searching for, and this idea that it was more fun over the hill. When you were working as a music journalist in the 80s, what would you say your primary motivation was? Were you looking for fun, or did you have a more sort of, I don't know the word, scholarly or intellectual role that you felt like you were filling when you were performing this music journal?
Okay, well, Matvey, I would say this is an existentialist question, of course, sort of. And well, here I can tell you that that throughout all my life, I've been looking for interesting situations, beautiful girls, and fun, as you've just formulated. I mean, I've never had any sense of mission or whatever. I just wanted to make my own life and the life of my friends more lively and more active, and also kind of culturally and emotionally more fulfilling. This was my main motivation, and I'm afraid I didn't think about anything more serious than that.
Wonderful. Tom, do you want to jump in? Oh, I mean, either of the Toms.
Well, Dr. Garza, we haven't heard from you yet, so I'm sure you'd have an interesting take on either of those questions.
Thanks, the other Tom. Two things very quickly. First of all, just in this last comment that Art was making, which I'm very taken with his answer in every respect, but I'll let my now getting even older memory maybe remind him. So when, an event which I certainly remember better than he does, because for me, I was kind of fanboying all over the place, getting a chance for the first time in '86 to meet Art, quite by accident, actually, at in Leningrad. But I remember introducing myself to him in Russian, him looking me up and down. He was still very much at that, I'm sorry, Art, I shouldn't put you into the third person here, but so pardon that, because I know we're actually still face to face here. But I remember you mentioning, you looked me up and down and said this with that wonderful tone of the late Soviet period, just simply, "Kto vy?" Almost in an accusatory, so who do you work for way. And I just simply said that я аспирант из Гарвардского университета, пишу диссертацию на эту тему. To which you then looked me again up and down and said, все объяснено, ученый. And I say that only because I wanted to go back to Matt's question about what your relationship then is to the Academy. And I wanted to say that I think your relationship to the Academy has come a long way in the last 30 years. I'm very glad now that you tend to embrace the Academy and universities much more. You are now basically an adjunct professor in at least a dozen universities around the world. So welcome, Professor Troitsky, to the Academy now.
Well, thank you. And well, actually, I would never imagine, like back in 1986, that I could become a scholar, because I hated school, I hated university. I was the worst student. You know, I've studied economy. I've graduated. My diploma was on экономическая кибернетика, the economy and cybernetics, and I have to confess that I forgot everything about economy and cybernetics the day I've got my diploma. And I would never think that I could end up as a lecturer, as a scholar, as a person, who writes well, books that may be labeled as at least relatively scientific, because well, subculture is definitely. I think it reads like a textbook. Not as boring as most of them, but still, you know, it does feel like a textbook to me, at least. You know, it's very kind of, it's very detailed. It's, you know, it has no no kind of journalistic ambitions and things like that. You know, I try to be objective there and describe and partly analyze, you know, the what was happening with Russian subcultures throughout 2 centuries and so on. So yes, in a way, it may be considered like a piece of scholarship. So
I couldn't agree more.
I would never imagine this could happen to me.
No, I was going to say, I think your approach not only is very much a scholarly and academic approach, in response actually to the first answer you gave about the relation, or not the relationship, but the impact of more generally rock music on the second Russian Revolution, from Gorbachev to the collapse. It's an interesting point, because I agree with everything you say, and my only addition to it would be maybe giving it a slightly academic spin of a number of theories around why is it that youth movements in particular seem to have this kind of effect on political movements. I'll speak just from even the United States perspective, from as you started with the 60s and the Vietnam War, and indeed the hippie movement, and actually hippie verging on going really old school folk music, right? Because it was Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell. These were the voices actually that, even for the folk people of the previous generation, were actually the avant-garde for American youth. But what I want to get to is, so this model of a disenfranchised youth, whether we're talking about American young people in the 1960s, Russian youth in the 1980s and early 1990s, contemporary post-Soviet Russian youth, there's this interesting model that you go from disenfranchisement to some kind of empowerment, that something catalyzes empowerment. And then after you get the sense back that you've been empowered, to mobilization, that you become now an actual political force. That third step doesn't always happen.
Yes.
Right, it doesn't always happen. And where I think rock music played in Russia, and certainly in the United States, even I thinking in the very recent, if you remember, just a few years ago, I'm now blanking on the year, I want to say 2017, the Je suis Charlie movement in France after the terrorist bombings also had music behind them. Even watching this response to COVID, we see all these viral videos of doctors from the Mayo Clinic singing John Lennon songs on the steps of the Mayo Clinic. I mean, music tends to be a kind of catalyst force to bring in that mobilization of whatever group of people, whether it's youth or other. And in Russia, Soviet Russia, and now post-Soviet Russia, I think music is still playing that role. Your point, though, I think is exactly right, Art, is that the movement then from mobilization, from empowerment to mobilization and all, doesn't always happen, that they don't always then go and vote, for example, as they could in contemporary Russian young people, I mean, or actually—
And I don't hear you anymore. Okay.
So whose mic is off? Is it mine or?
Oh, I hear you fine. You're coming through.
Oh, perfect. Okay, good.
Can you hear us fine?
Yeah.
I'll just make a short note. Well, I do agree. I do agree entirely with your analysis, and I think that catalyst is probably the perfect word to describe what youth movements and rock music done to the Soviet society at that time. You know, but there's also one big difference. I mean, I think that in America, of course, the role of young people in direct political happenings of that era has been much stronger than the one in Russia. The only episode in contemporary Russian history, but it was a crucial episode, the most important episode, when young people played a very important role, was in August 1991, I mean, if it wasn't young people who have surrounded the White House and created, you know, some kind of life shield around the White House, facing the tanks and armored cars and so on, then of course, you know, the whole history could go in a different way. But unfortunately, after that glorious episode, Russian young people again for a couple of decades, they went somewhere else. They went drinking.
Tom, I have just a comment on what you said. I think we're seeing the way that music is once again playing a role in mobilization, but I think that during during coronavirus, but I think we're also seeing music, or we're also seeing a lot of nostalgia during this coronavirus. And I was wondering, what is it about this coronavirus that is kind of leading to this kind of outburst of nostalgia, where we have people like, just one example is Boris Grebenshchikov all of a sudden is putting out new music on his YouTube channel, and his followers on there are saying, oh, thank you so much, Boris, that you're not forgetting about us during these difficult times. What is the relationship between kind of an event like this and nostalgia for those times?
Right. There's a wonderful work, a whole series of work actually by an unfortunately late but brilliant scholar from Harvard, Svetlana Boym, Russian herself actually, but emigrated to the US actually at a very young age to do her education at Harvard. And she works in this area worked in the area of nostalgia of two kinds, reflective and restorative, kind of good nostalgia, bad nostalgia, but based at the core of the theory is that precisely in times of, I'll be generous and call it flux, but especially in times of turmoil, we look then to the past to see what was good about it that we want to hold on to. Sometimes that's a very comforting thing, to remind ourselves of how things were before, in this case, before the plague, before COVID-19, what was it life like? And we hold on to the feelings we got when we heard that Beatles song, or that, I'll go more for a millennial generation, for that Coldplay song, or whatever your comfort music was for a period of time. And it doesn't matter whether you're an American, a Russian, a Syrian. As we think a pandemic is an interesting situation in that respect, because it really does show us kind of a global effect that is, for better or worse, universal, is this reflex to retreat a bit into one's past, cherry pick the things that we want to reflect on, and use those to hold on to get us through until we're out of this dark period. And so I'm absolutely buoyed by for my generation in particular. I get a lot of the OK boomers, not just from the US side, but from the Russian side. Every time I say, oh, it's so great to hear Grebenshchikov singing on YouTube, and they go, seriously, Grebenshchikov? And yet these now Gen Zers are saying, yeah, my dad's music does have a kind of warmth to it. So I love that. I love whether it's hearing Grebenshchikov in Moscow or I should say on YouTube, so it's all over the place now. He's even his Facebook channel is playing these little clips that he's putting out, or whether it's hearing the doctors at the Mayo Clinic singing John Lennon. It's just this wonderful feeling of that song has the right lyrics at the right time to be hearing in this moment.
Well, I think that nostalgia, of course, is a very natural medicine, natural cure at the times of panic. And at the moment, I see more of this happening in the US than Russia. I mean, I'm following, of course, all kinds of musical sites with a lot of contributions from famous artists to the present situation and so on. I think I was especially touched by Neil Diamond singing Sweet Caroline with new lyrics about washing hands and so on. It was so touching. But well, maybe I'm going to wrong places. But in Russia, I see more of modern authors and more young people singing актуальное. Well, what's the English word for актуальное, злободневное?
Current.
Current songs about current situation. Like, you know, there's a big hit right now by a bard named Semyon Slipakov, which already has like 5, 6, 7 million views. Then only today there's a new song called "Охуевшая" by a popular band called Rap Fuck. And in the video for "Охуевшая" there's also me playing my electric ukulele at Stalin home, and there are several other songs by young performers. So they are not so much of a nostalgia thing, but rather they're kind of angry young songs about what the hell is going on, and why are the government leaving us alone, and you know, what is this shit that is happening. And I think that there's well, I don't know about America. Seems it's quite different. But in Russia, I think there's not much room for nostalgic feelings.
So where I think there is,
it's rather about anger.
So Art, I think you're right, and I think you hang out in much cooler circles than most of us have the privilege to hang out in from stateside, from the U.S. But what we do have access to here, unfortunately, maybe fortunately, unfortunately, is Channel 1, Первый канал in Russia. So we get to see a lot of what the official Putin side of this nostalgia, which I would say is indeed there, and it's not to make the distinction that this scholar Boehm makes. It's not reflective. It's not that what made us feel good, but rather restorative nostalgia, which is let's remember how great we were and bring that back again. Does that sound familiar? Let's make Russia great again. Does that sound something? So on Первый канал, I watched with great interest and horror the 8 Marta concert that was given, the International Women's Day concert. So again, COVID was already very much part of the news, although Russia has consistently been keeping it down. At that time, there were no reported deaths in Russia on March 8th, zero, at a time when China was in the thousands and Europe now, Italy in particular, were in the tens of thousands of illnesses and hundreds, if not thousands of deaths. Russia had nothing at the time. And so it was being kind of viewed as this almost святое место, the holy place where, like the chosen land, God would never let a virus hit the Russian territory. And this concert, which was, of course, the official Kremlin voice, Channel 1, had all the old standards. There was Pugacheva, there were all Rataru, all of the usual suspects from the 70s and 80s. And it was really creating this feel that you were sitting once again in the great Soviet Union of the late 70s, early 80s. I watched people of our generation, yours and mine, sitting there with tears in their eyes as Alla Pugacheva was singing Million Alikros, and I was thinking, goodness gracious, this is quite remarkable. The idea of feeling good about it, about yourself and so forth, is all about recreating what was so great about the Soviet Union, not about comforting the national spirit of the time. It's quite remarkable. So you're getting to see a lot more interesting things than I'm getting to see going on in Russia right now.
Well, sure, Tom, but the nostalgic agenda, which may be called "Let's make Russia Soviet again," it's it's going on for already several years.
Oh, absolutely.
In all fields, in every respect.
Yeah.
and of course, you know, the more economic blues Russian Federation faces, you know, the more you know, the Soviet soothing is used by the propaganda.
Right.
Artemy, I just wanted to jump in and say that I think you may be experiencing, shall we say, a thanking man's version of this kind of nostalgia, because you posted a very interesting kind of award in the style of some Soviet award where it says Veteran Apocalypsisa, right? So a veteran of the apocalypse. And we have Krach SSSR and Chernobyl. And so, I mean, maybe for you, for kind of, shall we say, thinking post-Soviet people, is there kind of this feeling that I've already been through this before, a cataclysmic event like this, and so therefore I will survive? And I know you personally talked about your experience going through cholera in southern Russia. So is that kind of what you're feeling?
Yes, I think so. I just, you know, by posting, you know, these funny pictures, you know, I'm trying to somehow to entertain my friends on Facebook, and you know, I think that the general message there is that we've already been through a lot of nasty things, and so please don't panic. Be sensible, and just make sure that that you will not think that you know, we are the victims of the Judgment Day. So yes, I like this veteran of apocalypse. How do you call it? Patch? Yes, a patch.
Yes, patch. Yeah.
Yeah, and yes, I've attached some personal memories to this. When I was a hippie in 72 or 73, yes, I was a patient in this Yalta hospital for infection diseases, and this was exactly at the time of cholera. Although I've had something far less significant, but I was watching, I was witnessing, you know, all those hysterical movements around me, and thank God that I didn't get infected then.
I have a quick. I didn't realize we are going to get nostalgic about diseases like cholera, just nostalgic about music. But I mean, in general, this conversation, as you two as music critics, and when we talk about nostalgia, and at least when we look at American movies, it's Queen, it's Elton John, what have you. These were not cool to write about as a music critic when they were contemporaries. But we look back in eras, it is only the heavy hitters. There's not a Mike and the Mechanics movie coming out anytime soon. At least that's not what gives us quite a bit of So I'm curious, just how do you guys view that sort of push and pull between the intellectualism, but in the importance of pop music? It is the most pervasive thing we have in society, but when it's happening, it's the least cool thing to be interested about or label yourself as a consumer of. So I'm curious how maybe that's different in Russia or the USSR than it's in America, but it's always something I'm, you know.
Yeah, I had a very similar question for Artemy, so I would love to hear their thoughts on this.
Okay, well, first of all, I wasn't a big fan of neither Elton John nor Queen in the early and the mid 70s. At that time, I was already an underground kid, and I listened to Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart and King Crimson, Pink Floyd. I mean, prog rock bands, psychedelic bands, and not this pop shit or glam kind of type rock music, you know, of Elton John and Queen. So therefore, I've seen both movies, and I did not find them especially interesting. I mean, for my taste, film like Leta with Victor Tsoi is far more interesting and entertaining, and you know, for me it's much deeper than those biopics, which simply, you know, follow in every detail the glorious career of famous pop stars, which imitate, you know, their costumes, their stage gimmicks, and all that. I just thought that, you know, it's not a very interesting story. For me, like say The Doors by, I'm sorry, Oliver Stone, a big Putin supporter, was far more interesting because it was a film not about a particular rock star, Jim Morrison. It was more like a film about all those turbulent and crazy and controversial times of the 60s. So I think that back then, back in the 20th century, back in the 60s and the 70s, well, at least those 2 decades, of course, pop music was considered as something much more significant than it is seen now. I think that, you know, by many, actually by millions, pop music, especially rock music, was seen as a kind of experience, maybe even a religious experience, you know, not just entertainment or something you can dance to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm afraid that this is not the case. This is not the case right now. So, you know, right now, music, even music by very, very good artists and great poets and so on, is taken more like well, some kind of easy stuff, like a background music. I mean, you put on your headphones and you write text messages, and at the same time you listen to Bob Dylan and things like that. By the way, Bob Dylan's song about JFK assassination, which was made public literally like 4 or 5 days ago, it's a fantastic piece of poetry. But again, I'm sure that by most listeners right now, it is, you know, it's just an old man mumbling, you know, his blues lyrics about heroes of the past, you know, nothing special. You know, it's not taken like Bob Dylan songs were perceived in the 60s, when they were, you know, seen as a revelation by many. So, well, I don't know whether I answered your question or not, but I just, you know, said something.
I think you answered more interesting questions than I did.
I mean, if we're ready, we can continue to come back to music at some point, but I would like each of our guests to put on their kind of a political commentator cap for a second. So Artemy, you can be Djadji Choma, and Tom, you can obviously put on whichever political commentary hat you'd like. But I'm curious how we think this virus is going to affect kind of the Putin regime and just kind of the political situation in Russia. I was on a call with the Atlantic Council this morning, and there was, which is a DC think tank, and there was significant back and forth between experts who thought that the virus was actually going to give a great rallying effect for the regime and kind of strengthen Putin and kind of give yet another chance for the government to show itself to be kind of strong and to bring the people together like it's the great patriotic war again, versus other people who thought that it would be a catastrophe and that Putin would, you know, demonstrate himself incompetent or something like that. So, and I think that there's fantastic arguments for both sides. And so I'm just curious kind of what you guys think about this. Given your background on, you know, mobilization and youth and the way that these things can all kind of play into a political change.
Okay. Well, no later than tomorrow, I'll have a streaming session at my YouTube channel. And I always ask the viewers to send me some questions in advance, so I could start streaming with their questions, and then of course they will put more questions during the session. And I've already got about 30 or 40 questions, and nearly all of them are about this very thing that you're asking about what will be the consequences of COVID-19 for Putin's regime. Will it break it or will it make it stronger? And I don't want to pretend that I know the answer. Of course, the situation is so confused. It's confused everywhere. Nobody knows what will happen with economy. Nobody knows what will happen with healthcare. Nobody knows nothing. Well, first of all, nobody knows when the bloody things ends up. So I think that this is now an issue where one can only make all kinds of guesses and measure these pros and contras. One thing that is definitely playing against Putin is the worsening of the economic situation and the fact that he apparently doesn't look like a strong leader. Putin is lost. Putin looks miserable. Everyone sees it. And well, of course, it doesn't come as a surprise to most Russians, because Putin has never been an able crisis manager. You know, look at his behavior at the time of Kursk submarine, Nordost, Beslan, and so on. He is, well, he's really weak at being a leader in under tough circumstances. So this all plays against him. Then, of course, there are also some things that plays for him, and this is the fact that people are simply, you know, they feel totally panicky, and of course, you know, if people are panicking, then they need a firm hand, then they need some paternal care and so on. So psychologically, I think the virus may play for Putin, but materially and economically, it definitely plays against him. So who will win in this fight of two elements? I don't know, but I definitely think that the situation in the near half a year in Russia will change drastically. Yes, another thing that all political analysts note after Putin's yesterday's message is that, well, he apparently gave far more power to the regions of Russian Federation, which means that now all those governors who've been almost invisible before and who simply followed the orders from Kremlin, now apparently they've been asked by helpless Putin to make their own decisions. And this also can lead anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually quite similar to what's happening in America, of Trump sort of deferring decision making to the governors, because I think no one really wants to make a call on this because no one knows what's happening. No one knows when it's going to end. It's just easier to defer. Sort of in the same line, though, I read some of your writing at the turn of the century, and you talk about Putin's voodoo, how he kind of just has this mystique about him. Do you think it's possible, so, you know, with the potential 12-year extension of Putin's rule, can you have this sort of voodoo as a political leader in your late 70s? Was this kind of just Putin as a new youthful Russian leader? Do you think it's possible for that to continue, coronavirus or not?
Huh. Now, what do you mean by voodoo?
Well, I'm using your words against you, I guess. You know, he just kind of had this non-charisma. I don't know how to describe it. He isn't.
Yeah. Well, some kind of mysterious good luck. Well, I think Putin's good luck has expired a long time ago. Mm-hmm. I think it has expired in 2014. I think that the invasion of Ukraine was his fatal mistake. If he stopped at the Crimean Peninsula, then he probably would be much better now. But invading eastern Ukraine and the case of the Malaysian flight MH17 and the following sanctions and, you know, general absolute disrespect for Russia in the outside world. I think that this, you know, this was the beginning of the end for Putin and the end of his voodoo abilities. And I think that since then it's going from bad to worse for Mr. Putin. I mean, he still steal billions and put them in their pockets. He still may be in power and have loyal army and a national guard and so on. But apparently he has lost most of his reputation abroad, and he is very quickly losing popularity with the majority of Russian, even those who were never into politics and who were never even thinking about protesting. Now let me bring an adapter because my iPad is collapsing. I'll be back in literally 1 minute.
Take your time. All right, we have a quick pause. Is there anything you're trying to lead into, Matt? We've got about 15 minutes left or so.
No, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I do have some more questions for Artemy, but I thought I would ask him if I could, you know, get an interview with him maybe sometime next week or something. Just because there's so much to touch on. And
yeah, and I mean, maybe you could do something in Russian too.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah. So it's going great so far. I was just going to say that, Tom, after the fact, you and Matt need to hang out and do an intro.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that for sure.
Don't leave me. All right.
I'd love to have about just a couple of minutes after Art finishes his bit to...
I'm finished already. The iPad is safe.
Perfect. To be able just to respond to the kind of Putin-Trump who wins after COVID.
Okay.
Yes, please. Yeah, y'all continue.
Okay.
All yours.
And take it away.
So I just wanted to say a couple of things actually in response to Artemy's comments on Putin and whether Putin wins or loses in the COVID-19 issue, in a similar vein, whether or not Trump wins in the COVID-19 situation, because I find the two in similar and yet very different circumstances in the two countries. Very few of you, and I'm curious actually if even among the five of us gathered here now, knew that 2 days ago, since we're all Russianists here of one kind or another, we probably would say yes to this, but 2 days ago, a large Russian freighter plane arrives in New York with supplies to help out New York City's COVID crisis. It was covered very marginally by the news, very marginally. I've talked to 3 dozen people via Zoom in the last 48 hours. No one had heard that Russia had brought this aid to the US. Now, in any other political situation other than the age of Trump, the idea that humanitarian aid, especially of something like medical supplies, would be coming to our largest metropolis in the country would be viewed as a sign of incredible weakness and incredible incompetence of our government to take care of the population of the single largest city in the country. And yet, not only do we hear little from the press, the media in general, about how Russia did this act of seemingly generosity, but clearly a massive PR move on Putin's part to be sending aid to the United States, to the United States at this crisis time. But the Trump supporters, who at any other time would say, the Russians helping us, are you kidding? Send it back. If it were Obama, send it back. We don't want this tainted aid from that communist country coming to our shores. Nothing, not a word, radio silence. And indeed, I think it was a kind of, I'm using that incident from 48 hours ago as a metaphor for the whole PR spin that both presidents, Putin and Trump, are making this catastrophe, this disaster, this pandemic, this international crisis into a play for their own success. The reason, in reference to something Tom said a few minutes ago, that I think that Trump continuously, I keep conflating the two names because it's kind of become Putin and Trump separated at birth, that Trump continuously sends everything back to the states is specifically because as long as things don't get federalized, things like, for example, invoking the nationalization of things like the production and distribution of emergency PPEs or everything from, the face masks and ventilators, all of these kinds of things, and the production indeed of an antidote to the COVID virus is because as long as it remains in private hands, there are profits being made. And I hate to sound like the Marxist that I am, but it's true. Trump is a consummate Marxist, and a consummate, I should say, capitalist, and will continuously support his cronies. How was it yesterday, everybody, by the way, that we hit nearly, we did hit the 10 million mark of unemployment filings in this country, and the stock market rises by 500 points? How does that happen? If anyone truly still believes that the stock market is going up because of my pension or anyone else's pension, forget about it. This is all about money going into the pockets of the same people that got Trump elected in the first place. And so that's a long-winded way of saying Trump is using the COVID crisis, as is Putin, to their political advantages, to what end they can. I don't think that in the wash, it's going to help either of them. My only concern about the US is, and I ask myself this question every day, where's Joe Biden? Do we ever even see him? Do we ever even hear him give us anything, any kind of statement about the situation? No. So our leading candidate for the Democrats is basically persona abscondidus for these last nearly 2 months now. We hear more from Bernie Sanders. Every now and then we'll get a statement from him on the situation. So I think, in short, both Putin and Trump are using the COVID crisis to their ostensible advantage, but I don't think either of them, I agree with Artemy, I think they're both going to wind up coming out as losers when it's all said and done.
Let me just add one thing to the Putin aid to New York City. I think the scandal is not over there yet, because it's been revealed today that a lot of equipment which has been brought by the Russian plane was produced by a company belonging to Rostech, which is under sanctions. Even more than that, the organization called a Russian Fund of Priority Investments, who have paid for part of the shipment, they are also under sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the move on Putin's side here was even more vicious.
Yeah.
He knew that these companies are under sanctions. Of course, America wouldn't send this aid back because, well, apparently it does need some stuff for the suffering New York City.
Very
but
much.
then they could say, well, you have de facto violated the sanctions regime. So let's do it de jure as well. And this is what they've tried at the United Nations later today or yesterday.
Yeah, I think of, well, first of all, it's probably the first time in my life that I like really wanted to know where Joe Biden was. Usually I'm very comfortable not knowing where he is.
Where's
But
Joe?
I would say of all things, the loss here, it's the death of economic conservatism. Like you said, we're violating sanctions and no one's talking about it. And we're using the Fed like a piggy bank. I mean, like thinking of Trump in 2016, basically currently espousing, modern monetary theory, just printing money without any concern on what's going to happen to it. We're basically using the Fed as a hedge fund, leveraging $400 billion into 4 to 5 trillion in credit. And the stock market is fine. We're fine with 10 million unemployed. I think there's also just this freeze to life. No one is calling in their loans. There aren't margin calls. People are pretending like they're liquid when they're not. And I think right now it's so hard to make predictions of what's going to come next because politically, economically, socially, we're frozen. Everyone is quarantined to an extent.
Tom,
So,
I just would add to what you're saying, which was brilliantly stated, by the way. That would have been a stellar A+ paper in any good political economics course.
well, now just a pass. There are no grades anymore, just passes and fails.
Yes, we'll change it all to pass fail. It's but honestly, I'm not to sound obviously like a not hysterical but historical alarmist here. Every symptom you just described was symptomatic both of the Weimar government in Germany and of the U.S. economy back in 1929. As I say, we don't have the mechanisms in place any longer that a crash of the magnitude of the great crash of 29 could happen again, but an analogous, a sort of analog to what happened all those decades ago is exactly under the circumstances you just described.
Minus the virus.
Minus the virus, that's right. Although we did have the Dust Bowl. Yes.
Between those two, I think I'd rather be the U.S. in 1929 than the Weimar, which is
sure. And Tom, just to kind of carry that thread even further, it's not just kind of right. I mean, what did those situations lead to in Weimar Germany and in 1929 America? It led to emergency measures in the political sphere, and I think that's the other thing that we're going to see. Right, the moving of elections, the cancellation of elections.
Yes.
I know that, Putin obviously recently changed the constitution and was supposed to put his changes up for this kind of, meaningless vote. And there was this idea that people would protest the vote, right? Boycott and instead protest on the day of the vote. But now that obviously can't happen because people are barred from protesting. So it's a very kind of lucky way for a lot of these leaders to avoid the protest to their action. That's kind of the sinister nature of this pandemic, is that it's going to lead to these economic consequences that would normally cause massive street mobilization, but that can't happen because it's a pandemic. So it's really sinister in that sense.
Indeed, indeed.
So we're coming up towards the end of our hour. This is not a conversation I have any interest in cutting off, but for our listeners' sake, I think we have to. Dr. Garza, you're a regular now. You're terrific as always. Artemy, we'd love to have you back as soon as we can. This was so much fun. Do you guys have any lingering thoughts, last observations, maybe a new skill you've picked up in quarantine that you just want to share? Maybe started needle pointing or something.
I've actually been doing a lot more long overdue writing that I've needed to do, which is a good thing. But I will admit that I have discovered the joy of woodworking, just kind of to kind of calm my nerves a bit, and have been working on redoing a lot of the wood trim in the house just on my own.
Oh, wow.
Just because, right? Because it's there. It didn't need it, but why not? And that's purely about, I think actually, there you go. This is going into the nostalgia argument we started this whole conversation with, is we go back at times like these to find the things that give us a little bit of comfort, that just make us feel, give us a warm fuzzy in our heart and in our gut, and we get by day.
Well, I think we're all capitalizing on this huge amount of time to kill. And let's not kill this time, but use it for a good purpose. We are watching a lot of movies that we have missed in our lives, you know, starting from the Italian neorealism of the late 40s and the 50s, and up to recent films, American, Russian, European, everything. And I have also, you know, when in London in February, I bought an electric ukulele. And I'm now playing it with a delay pedal, so I'm producing all kinds of underground rock sounds with an electric ukulele. And well, generally speaking, you know, I've wrote about it in my posts in Facebook and Twitter, that suddenly, despite all the really tragic things that are going on around us, it is possible to turn all these into something good. Yeah. And let's all use this opportunity.
Yeah.
And stay well, of course, which is absolutely crucial.
Here. I agree.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And regards to your family, and your friends, and to the glorious city of Austin and the University of Texas.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. We'll all enjoy some De Sica, Rossellini, some Italian neorealism. And
yeah, there you go. There you go.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye. Cheers.
Matvey, do you have something?
Так, все, да нет, I just wanted to invite our